Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, SANS 2022 Cyber Threat Intelligence Survey. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Pasquale Sterparo, SANS Certified Instructor Candidate and SANS CTI Survey author, Rebecca Brown, SANS Certified Instructor Candidate and SANS CTI Survey author as well, Megan Gooch, Manager, Threat Research at Eclectic IQ, Bob Hansman, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Infoblox, and David Monnier, SANS Fellow, Team Cymru. Today's agenda includes SANS 2022 CTI Survey, Key Findings and Trends, led by Rebecca Brown, observations on responses from the 2022 SANS CTI Survey, presented by Megan Gooch, demonstrating CTI value through defense, investigation, and response, presented by Bob Hansman, how pure signal recon gives you an advantage, presented by David Monnier, and a panel discussion moderated by Pasquale Sterparo, accompanied by Megan Gooch, Bob Hansman, and David Monnier. We invite you to join the SANS Analyst Slack workspace and engage directly with SANS authors, sponsors, and fellow attendees. The Slack link is on the slide and will be presented or posted in Zoom. We ask that all participants adhere to the SANS Code of Conduct. SANS strives to create an atmosphere of learning, growth, and community. We value the participation and input in this event and in the industry of people of all genders, sexual identities, cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds, races, ethnicities, nationalities, religions, and ages. Please support this atmosphere with respectful behavior and speech. This applies to all online interactions, including the event Slack channel and in Zoom. If you witness or experience anything contrary to these guidelines, please tell us at analyst@sans.org. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A window in Zoom or in the discussion channel in Slack at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Pasquale.
Thank you, Carol. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending where you are. Good day, everyone. My name is Pasquale Sterparo. I'm one of the co-author of the SANS CTI survey and the SANS instructor for the Cyber Threat Intelligence class 4578. Just a few words about myself. I've been working in the forensics, incident response, and threat intelligence space for about 14 years, and I'm currently principal adversary hunter in the threat intelligence team at Dragos. And before joining Dragos, I was security incident manager at Google. And today I will be moderating the second part of the webinar, joined by our great panelists. But now I'm gonna give the floor to my SANS colleague and CTI survey partner in crime, Rebecca Brown, who is also a SANS instructor and is also one of the co-author of the Cyber Threat Intelligence class for 578. She'll walk us through this year's survey results, which are going to be, there are quite some interesting insights, but I'm not going to spoil anything, and I'll let Rebecca take it from here. So the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Pasquale. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. I've been working on this survey now for several years, either as an author or helping out with analysis behind the scenes. And it's been really exciting to watch the industry grow. We also were able to watch as things changed pretty drastically during the shift to exclusive remote work due to the COVID-19 lockdowns. Everything changed. The threats changed, the way CTI analysts and programs operated had to change, stress levels most certainly changed. And this year we were curious to see if things kind of snapped back into place as people got their bearings. But spoiler alert, that's not what we saw. Only time will tell if these are permanent changes or things that are just taking time to adjust back onto the path they'd previously been on. Some of the trends are definitely things that we as a CTI community can work on. For example, the second bullet on our slide here, we saw a continued downward trend in collaboration between CTI teams and other stakeholders, which is actually a critical component of CTI. And luckily we've got some additional learnings as to maybe why that was the case and what we can do about it. but certainly not all of the changes that we saw were bad. One big trend we saw that I think is actually fantastic is an increase in organizations who are just building out their CTI capabilities. We saw this reflected in the data a couple of different ways that we'll step through, but also in the comments that if you took the survey yourself, there's a lot of opportunities to add additional details, tell us more. And we saw a lot of people talking about, we're starting out, we're just building a program, we're working on the basics. A lot of people expressing kind of that, okay, what's next? What do we do? And so I think one of the things I love about this community, and we have all of our wonderful panelists here, Pasquale as well, and the CTI course, is that we're able to help people, I think, stand up these new programs much more efficiently than we did when we first started this survey many, many years ago. We have a lot of tools, a lot of tricks, and a lot of learnings. But continuing on with our key takeaways, one of the other things we identified is that CTI teams are still struggling to measure impact. This is something we consistently saw since we started asking about this question. And again, being able to measure impact is very important, both for growing a program, but also making sure that your team and your program is operating in an efficient way, focusing on the right things. Another key takeaway was that many teams are not using a consolidated threat intelligence platform. Many still use some ad hoc methods of capturing data, analyzing data. Many use home-built tools. And that could also be something where coming up with a consolidated way to look at your data, to share your data, could address some of these other kind of pain points that we have discovered. So let's dive into the specifics. We looked at CTI teams and processes. We saw kind of amongst our top 4 industries represented, we had banking and finance, government, and cybersecurity service providers, which are we see them a lot over the years. They've been great participants, always taking time to respond to the survey and provide their insights. But that last sector, education, is a new one for us. And we think that might be reflective of some of the changes we saw with the shift to remote work. The educational institutes, K through 12, higher education, they were all kind of had to very rapidly adjust. And in addition, adversaries identified those as a target, especially for things like ransomware, because it was very important that we keep the availability and the confidentiality of student data and their ability to learn up and running. And so seeing more participation from the education sector on our CTI survey is fantastic, because that could be one of the areas where we see growth within the CTI teams and communities. In addition, we saw that we had the highest number of responders came from small organizations, followed by our very large organizations, which is also expected. A lot of large organizations have a massive attack surface, but also have a lot of teams and support functionality with robust CTI teams. So it's great to kind of see things from both perspectives, both people just starting out small and those with robust programs, how those changed and shifted over the last few years. We saw the top 4 roles represented included security operations analysts, CTI analysts, security managers, and incident responders. And then we also had a global response, which was great because we can see, make sure that we aren't focusing on one particular region and the issues and the trends that they're seeing, but really take a better look at how the industry as a whole is growing and being impacted by various things. As far as CTI functions, we have asked for several years now, is this a service that is done in-house, done exclusively by a service provider or an external vendor providing CTI services, or is it a combination? Our in-house has stayed steady, similar with last year, right around 36%. What's interesting is that we are seeing more teams with a combination rather than just exclusively relying on external vendors. And I think that that is a really good place to be, especially if it's a new team. Having someone in-house with that experience, knowing what are your goals, what is the data you're protecting, what are the things that are unique to your organization. And when you're a new function, being able to pair that with an experienced service provider who can introduce processes, point you towards the right collection, I think that can really be a force multiplier for new teams and experienced teams experiencing an increase in threats as well. Presently, the most useful forms of CTI that people reported are things like detailed information about malware, information about vulnerabilities being leveraged, and broad attacker trends. These things are all very important, I think, for CTI analysts to get their bearings and to know, are they focusing on the right things? Are they equipped and able to respond to these threats and provide information to the security operations centers or incident responders as needed? These all seem like very good uses of kind of current intelligence. Most useful in the next 12 months, we ask our respondents to predict if things continue the way they are 12 months from now, what type of information will be most useful. And in addition to a continuation of things, we think detailed information about malware and vulnerabilities, since those don't stay static, they always change, those will always be useful. But in the next 12 months, respondents reported that things like industry-specific attack information and even true attribution of adversaries would become more important. One of my favorite things about the survey this year was that we introduced some questions around analysis and how CTI intelligence analysts actually conduct that analysis, which means that we now are able to cover every step of the intelligence cycle. So we were able, now I'm going to step through kind of talking through step by step what people are saying and how they're leveraging the intelligence cycle as they carry out their duties. So the first step, if you're not familiar, is requirements. So understanding what questions are you trying to answer about the threats against your organization? What is important to other teams you support, key stakeholders, leadership? And it's really important for these things to be clearly and explicitly stated. Otherwise, CTI analysts might spend a lot of time and a lot of effort chasing down something or focusing on understanding an adversary that isn't actually is of significance or going to be useful to others. So we asked both whether organizations have formal requirements and then how often they update those requirements. We are at one of those trends that I mentioned at the beginning that we're hoping will eventually course correct, is that we actually had, I think, the lowest, since we started asking this question, the lowest number of people who said that they do actually have formal requirements. It was right around 35%. And we peaked at 43% in, I believe, 2020 said they had formal requirements. So we're down a bit. But the good news is that we are still seeing those who do have requirements updating them. And updating your requirements is very important, especially as we see kind of these large shifts in threats and in operations. Because when things change, your requirements needs to change as well. Different things will become important to you. And it's important to make sure that analysts understand those changes and can adjust their collection and their analysis and the way that they're sharing information with their key stakeholders. We had 40% say that they do update their requirements, but ad hoc, kind of as needed, which is good. And then we have others who say they do have a process in place to update them, whether it's yearly, monthly, or weekly. 15% say they actually don't know if requirements get updated, which I think, since we've been talking about, we have newer organizations. Some people are still kind of getting their bearings. Hopefully next year, if they can answer those same questions, they'll have a better idea of how it works. But what's great is that we only have 3.4% who say they don't ever update their requirements. So I'm happy to see that number trending down. Once you have requirements, you know where you should start gathering your information from to actually address these needs. What we've seen over the past 2 years is that the top source for gathering information that will later become intelligence is external sources such as media reports and news. 81, almost 82% of people say that this is a source of information that they use. And I think this is indicative of a couple of things. First, if you're addressing, if your requirements are to be able to answer questions from executives or a CISO or someone else in leadership who might have to answer questions, for example, to a board about the threats, they're going to be looking at things that they hear about, see on the news, read about. And so having an eye and understanding what's being reported around cybersecurity threats is actually very important. But as we call out in the survey, being able to validate and vet this information and say whether or not, first of all, is it accurate? Is it being represented in a clear way. And then also being able to speak to the impact to your organization. Not every threat that's reported in the news that sounds really scary will have a direct impact on your organization. Some will, and especially with some of the trends that we've been seeing with widespread targeting, it very well could have an impact on your organization. But being able to speak to that and present that rather than just passing along information is really critical. In addition to this increase in external sources, we are still seeing a consistent amount of information being pulled in, things like threat feeds from CTI vendors, vulnerability data, and then open source or public CTI feeds also make up a large part of organizations' collections. In addition, we still see a high number of people gathering information from community or industry groups, and then threat feeds from general security vendors. What's important to remember around collection of data is that you never want to just focus on one single source. It's best to be able to pull from multiple places to be able to validate whether what you've seen in one place is an anomaly or is it actually something that is being seen multiple places. And it can also help provide that context that's needed to talk about whether a threat is or is not relevant to your organization. Once you have this information, it's really important to get it into a format that you can actually analyze and use and share. When we ask about processing in the survey, we talk about things like deduplicating data, getting data into a standard format. If you're pulling things from various areas, if you're pulling down a news report, on the latest ransomware attack, and also gathering hashes that other organizations have seen, they're not going to be in the same format. So getting that kind of standardized so you can look at the data together is another one of these processing tasks. Enriching automation or enriching information, doing a lot of pivoting on data from internal sources, external sources, or commercial sources as well. And then we also include in processing reverse engineering of malware samples. What we saw is that the goal for processing is often a task that we hope a machine can do. We hope that we can get it into a system, let it know what it is we're trying to do, whether it's the deduplication or the standardization, and then there's very little work for the analyst to do in this area. But what we're seeing is that in all these categories, fully automated processes are still under 20%, which is an increase from the past, but still relatively low. Most types of data are semi-automated, meaning we have some automation available, but there is still a fair bit of manual work from an analyst to do. And then malware analysis is still primarily a manual process. And to be fair, that is the most complex of all of those tasks. So it makes sense. And we are still making a lot of progress in automation of malware analysis. Analytic sandboxes are getting more robust, and they're able to export data. So there is some automation there as well. But this is an area where I think the more we can automate some of these tasks in a way where it is reliable and we're not losing data and it's not impacting analysis, the more we will be able to free up analysts' time to focus on higher level tasks. So speaking of higher level tasks, as I mentioned, this year we were able to ask about analysis. Which is one of my favorite aspects of the intelligence cycle. A lot of the work, the collection, the requirements are getting to this point where you can take all this information and actually start to answer those questions that are important to CTI stakeholders. So we started by asking about different methods of analysis and how often they're used. We have the use of conceptual models, things we teach in the Cyber Threat Intelligence course, Forensics 578, like the diamond model and the kill chain. There are also structured analytic techniques, things like key assumption checks, data clustering, and analysis of competing hypotheses, or ACH. Systems analysis methods that look at the various interconnecting parts, both of computer networks, but then also adversary networks as kind of abstract entities to better understand their operations. Threat modeling is a key analytic task and speaks towards previously we talked about collection. What is the threat to our organization of this entity that I'm reading about in the news? We also have a fair bit in CTI of inductive reasoning, typically driven by things like graph-driven analysis. And then intuitive or experience-based judgment. So what we saw is that a lot of these methods are kind of used occasionally. These are tools that CTI analysts have in their toolbox. They are available. People can pull them out and use them when needed, but they are not used frequently, and they're not used in a standardized or consistent way, even from analyst to analyst. And then if you look at the bottom there, that blue spike, the most common method that is used frequently is this intuitive or experience-based judgment. And while that's fantastic, because CTI analysts have over the years accumulated a lot of good experience-based judgment, it would be really great if some of that intuitive knowledge could actually be funneled through something like a conceptual model, where it could be better articulated and standardized and shared with newer analysts across the team. So as different analysts kind of go through your day-to-day and think about, how am I coming to this conclusion? How am I making this assessment? Can I explain it to someone on my team in a way where they could replicate it? That will help us move towards using more of these models and more of these frameworks in a consistent manner. The final step of the intelligence cycle is dissemination. So once you have these answers, once you've had, created these findings, how do you get that information to the right audience? And I love that we see this every year. Email of documents such as spreadsheets or PowerPoint presentations continue to be the one way that information reaches audiences. And I don't know whether to love that or hate that, because on one side, a lot of times there are better ways to tell a story than a spreadsheet of data. But at the same time, I probably have like 15 different notebooks up right now with all of my data in spreadsheets. So it's one of those areas where there's definitely a better way to do it, but it is very much the space that a lot of analysts live in now. And I think when we switch to talk about tooling, this is an area where it can be easier to take the way that analysts gather their data, the way we think about things, that easily be able to translate it into something that is easy to share with a higher level audience will make a lot of progress. We still see things about 62% of information is disseminated via formal reports. We have a lot of integration with threat intelligence platforms. So this is more tactical level dissemination, where we're feeding information into systems to do things like automatic blocks or alerts, rather than kind of presentations or analysts. But we do still have a lot of briefings, about 55%. And I'm guessing with the slow shift back to work, a lot of those presentations are over Zoom or some other platform. And we actually might be seeing an increase in briefings because of that availability to bring people together virtually. I'll be really interested next year or the following years or the following year after that to see whether or not we still see kind of a 50% of actual briefings for disseminating information. Again, we talked about CTI tools. What are all of these things that are enabling CTI analysts to step through the intelligence cycle? We still see the top tool used is spreadsheets. It's just something that works. Even some of the processing we were talking about, deduplication and standardization, you can do within a spreadsheet. And also, as we talked about, we have a lot of new teams. When new teams start out, they're often small. And we also had a lot of small organizations addressing or answering the survey. And so it's actually much easier to use things like a spreadsheet or an email when you're a small team in a small organization. But some of those other key insights that we had, things like measuring metrics and communication with other teams, when you're using tools that are better suited for a small audience or an audience who's looking at things or thinking about things the same way, you can actually impact your ability to share, disseminate, and spread that information and collaborate. And so the tools used, I think, is an important area that we can look at to say, if we want to increase our collaboration, both within the team as it grows and with other teams, what tools can we use and how can those support us? Another key finding here along those lines was the use of threat intelligence platforms, which the goal of threat intelligence platforms is to allow a team to collaboratively work to do a lot of those steps that we talked through with the intelligence cycle in one place and share information. Sometimes they do have some really kind of innovative and creative ways to disseminate the information as well, both through the direct connection to other security systems, but also to help, shortcut or create things like presentations or briefs. And so this could be an area where, as teams grow or as we seek to collaborate, moving from, an individual, a spreadsheet that you have kind of local to your machine, to something that's easier to share, easier to collaborate on, and supports different ways of thinking and different ways of approaching data, might help us with some of those other pain points we talked about. So moving forward, where do we go from here? I know our panelists are going to have a lot of great insights, their own takeaways, things that they can apply to what they've seen, in their day-to-day operations as well. But for Pasquale and I, when we were writing this, some of the things that we wanted to call out are that collaboration and communication are critical in this field. And both from our processes, our tools, everything needs to support this open communication and back and forth conversations. We saw that there was the focus on kind of the intuitive judgment. We think we can focus on formalizing and capturing and learning from that intuitive-based analytic process to help our field grow, and also to help some of the newer analysts learn new methods and new ways of analyzing data. And we also want to try to identify tools and systems to help standardize across the CTI process, especially with a focus on measuring effectiveness and impact. We want to make sure we're looking at the right things, we're thinking about things in the right way. But all in all, we were kind of, thrilled to see some of the ways that people are growing their programs, some of the things we're focusing on. Definitely room for improvement, but I think we are kind of moving in a good place towards the community. Pasquale, anything you want to add?
No, I think, I was, as you mentioned, also very, very excited for this webinar, because I think that the results are very interesting, very telling, also about the broader, what's the broader state of, let's say, other teams in the CTI space, and seeing the evolution. Because the other interesting thing is also seeing like how things are changing, better or worse. It's like there is no better or worse, like what are the trends over the years. So I think there was a very nice coverage, and I'm very looking forward now for all the Q&A later with our guests as well.
Awesome, thank you. Well, that is all I have from our survey.
Great. So before moving forward with our guest speakers, I wanted to just assume that like people were like from everywhere around the world, which is great. I want to encourage every one of you to please interact, like give a Q&A. There is a Q&A section in Zoom. Feel free to write your question for for everyone, or if you want to have a specific question, maybe related to one of the presentation you will see now, just type your question. If it's for a specific speaker, let us know, and we will then have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and also engage on the Slack channel. So we are really looking forward to hear also your opinion, and to hear what question you may want to have for our guests. Now moving forward with our next speaker is Megan Gooch, who is a manager of threat research at Eclectic IQ. I will let her now introduce herself, give us a few words about herself first, and then moving forward with the presentation. Please, Megan, the mic is yours.
Hi, great. Thank you so much, Pasquale, and thanks, Rebecca. And thanks to the whole SANS team for having me here today. It's really a pleasure to be speaking with everybody. My name is Megan Gooch, and I am the manager of threat research at Eclectic IQ. I have actually been in the field at Eclectic IQ for about 10 months now, so I am relatively new to the field. Really quick before I advance, it seems I can't quite advance my slides, so if somebody could help me out with that, that would be great. So anyway, I wanted to present, as I mentioned, I've been in the field I've been in CTI for about 10 months now at Eclectic IQ, and prior to that, I actually have a background as a traditional intelligence analyst. So I worked for the government doing counterterrorism analysis. And a lot of that forms the background for what I want to talk about today. I was really thrilled to read the survey results because I thought the survey covered so many questions that I would want to ask. And so I'm going to offer some comments today based on my background. Okay, I see Rebecca still has control of my screen, so I'm going to give her a minute to see if I can get permission to advance slides.
Excuse me, you should be able to click in advance now, Megan.
Okay,
Sometimes
there we
I have
go.
a hard
Thank
time
you.
Giving up power. Sorry, Megan.
Nope, they're fine. Thank you so much. All right, so every good presentation needs an agenda slide. Let me advance to mine. There we go. So I'm sure you all have heard of a great saying that is, where you stand depends on where you sit. I think there's a nugget of brilliance in there. So I'm going to present my observations about a few of the survey questions through the lenses of places that I used to sit as an intelligence analyst, or places that I sit now as somebody new to this field, somebody who's a manager of a team, or somebody who works at a tip vendor. So I will start off with looking at one of the questions in the survey through the lens of a traditional intelligence analyst. This here is question 16 of the survey, and it's all about how CTI data and information is used in an organization. And I want to say I loved this question. I think this question is so important for intelligence analysts. Being an intel analyst, one of the great drivers of doing your work, and one great source of gratification is knowing how your work is used to either support an operation or defend your organization or make a decision. And when analysts have that information, it's incredibly empowering. My experience has also been the flip side, is that if analysts don't understand how their work is used in an organization, it can really cause disillusionment. So with that as a background, when I look at this from my history as an intelligence analyst, working in governments and working with militaries quite often, I see something really pop out at me. And that is this. The answers here, aside from other at the very bottom, really settle out into three distinct groups that align nicely with tactical tasks, operational tasks, and strategic overarching tasks. The tasks at the top of the graph in the red box, the ones that our respondents said that they see most frequently, are those tasks that I would consider tactical. They are really 5-meter targets, and they reflect things that are easy to do and are quite urgent and also very easy to measure. The flip side of that is that at the bottom of the chart, the things that maybe just a quarter or maybe just a third of respondents indicated they're seeing are tasks that all fall into the strategic realm. These are things like education, budget, resource allocation, senior executive leadership, things like that are really tough to measure. And then in the middle, you have this group of things that I would consider operational. They're neither tactical 5-meter targets, nor are they extremely strategic initiatives. But I would say that these things really represent the guts of intelligence analysis. And doing these activities are quite difficult because they require a lot of time, a lot of dedicated effort, and a lot of intellectual humility to be able to do them well. But when people do them well, I think it really sets them apart as intelligence analysts. So the question is, why are we all shooting at 5-meter targets, and why is it so tough to understand if our work impacts user education or compliance or budgeting? Well, I think it could be a number of things, and I would love to hear people's thoughts on this. I definitely think that these strategic level initiatives are tougher to measure. It could be that the people who responded to this survey, they see things like blocking threats or security awareness, but they may not see how their work impacts user education, for example. It could be that some senior leaders don't really understand CTI yet, and they don't know how to work it into their processes and their decision making. So yeah, I'll be very interested to hear if other people have thoughts on that. But just as an intelligence analyst, when I look at this, I see that we as a community are still very tactically focused, and we're working our way up slowly but surely toward our more strategic initiatives. So to move on, my next question, this is a question about data processing done in CTI, question number 23 in the survey. And I wanted to look at this question through the lens of somebody who's new to cyber, as I am. I was very surprised at how little of the processes listed on this slide are fully automated. Fully automated is what you see in the green bars here. And I think that reflects one of my biases as somebody who began their career outside cyber. I think a lot of people who aren't working in cyber tend to think of cyber as a career field that has all the answers, that is super high speed, that uses all the latest and greatest tools, and where everything is automated. And that's kind of the assumption that I had going into this. So to look at this and to see the relatively low percentages of things that are fully automated definitely surprised me. I will say that one of the silver linings that I had when I looked at this slide was, as an intelligence analyst, I'm also a little bit relieved, because even in a field like cyber, I would never want to see complete and total automation. I think when some things you can automate pretty easily, but if you automate everything, then the human thought that we all add as analysts is lost, right? And that means we're not quite doing the level of analysis that we want to do. So yeah, room to grow in terms of automation and working smarter, not harder. But also it's so important to keep that analytic background, that analytic touch in the process. Next slide, also something I want to examine through the lens of somebody new to the field. This slide is about our methods leveraged in CTI analysis. This was question number 24 on the survey. And I know Rebecca pointed out this specific data point in her remarks, but I want to mention it as well. The blue bar off to the right of the screen with the really high response rate represents intuition and experience-based judgment used. And I think the percentage here is about 50%, about half of respondents said that they use intuition and experience-based judgment. But my guess is that probably that number should be close to 100%. I do believe that everybody uses tuition and intuition-based judgment and experience-based judgment, probably a lot more than they realize. And as I was talking with my team about this, they said, well, what if it just reflects the fact that, people in this field really like data-driven analysis. They want to make data-driven decisions. And I thought, yeah, that's probably pretty valid. But even with that, the choice to investigate or to look at a certain data set, right, reflects our judgment and our experience. So I think as CTI matures, we can expect to see this number rise. The second thing I want to point out is this other horizontal bar here capturing kind of the red lines. I was really pleased to see that other methods for CTI analysis, threat modeling, structured analytic techniques, graph-based analysis, I was pleased to see that these numbers were as high as they are. Certainly my experience outside of CTI is that oftentimes these techniques are relied upon as a technique of last resort. When there is so little information, it's tough to make a call, or when analysts are too entrenched in their positions and they need a technique to help walk them through their thoughts. So I would just say, bravo to the CTI community if we are in fact using these techniques as frequently as we say we are. I think that's something we should definitely sustain. All right, so let's move on to slide number 6. This one is about management tools. This was a question about management tools that are being used. And again, I know Rebecca brought up a couple of these points, but I just want to hit home my reaction surrounding this blue bar right here, which was use of spreadsheets and or email. I was shocked. You could have knocked me over with a feather that option got the single highest response rate of all the options presented. And I think, it really does say something that option, the spreadsheet option, along with the open CTI platform and the homegrown CTI platform, I was surprised those numbers were as high as they were. And I think that tells us that a lot of organizations are still feeling out what works for them, finding out that in some cases, the good old spreadsheet does work really well. But I think it indicates that, in terms of maturity, we are still figuring out what we want to do. I think the other piece of good news here, when I look at the spread of responses on this slide, is that what I see is no matter how you're doing your CTI data aggregation and analysis, you're probably not that far off the norm, which I think is always kind of reassuring. Let's move on to the next slide. From the perspective of a manager of a threat research team, oh man, I love this question. I'm so glad SANS asked it. And this is a question that I want to ask our customers and our readers. I think it ties back to the very first question I focused on about how CTI is used. What types of CTI are currently most useful to your organization? And what I take away here is that for those of us who now exist outside government, just about every type of CTI information is useful, save these two bars down here that reflect monetization and attribution, which are probably more useful for government analysts. But what this tells me as a manager is that my team and I can write about any number of topics, and we really can't go wrong. There will be utility and helpfulness in whatever we choose to write. Now, again, I was talking with my team about this particular question, and they said, this almost gives us the impression that we should stop doing, forward-leaning analysis, because what is most useful is analysis of events that have already happened. And so we kind of talked about, in the coming years, the need to strike the balance between addressing the need for information about past events and the current situation, and also trying to be really forward-leaning in our analysis. I think that is it for me. So pending your questions, that concludes my brief. I will be really excited to chat with people in Slack or take questions in the panel later on. Pasquale, I'm going to hand it back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Megan. Super interesting presentation. I like the deeper dive on a few specific questions, because it's always I really think this, as you show, like every question, then there is so much you can go a deep dive on each one of them and try to understand like how single individual things may apply to different teams and why also. So definitely interesting, and I'm really looking forward for questions from the audience. Please follow up with the speakers on Slack or in the Q&A section here in Zoom. Thank you again, Megan. I'll see you later. And next speaker is Bob Hansman, who is a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Infoblox. I'll let Bob. Hello, Bob. I'll let you introduce yourself, tell us a bit more about yourself, and then take it away with the presentation. The floor is yours.
All right. And if anybody hears any droning in the background, it's because we had a wonderful snowstorm, and this is the moment they've decided to snowplow outside my window. So I'm Bob Hansman. I've been in security for 37 years. I started out as an architect and designer for some of the early endpoint stuff. I was writing signatures for McAfee when it was a freeware tool. And I've kind of come up through the ranks when email security first came on the scene, because prior to that, number one way things got spread was via floppy disks of all things. And then email came out, killer app, and as Megan shared one of the charts there, or actually no, it was Rebecca in her presentation. Email is still the top way that these things get spread around. They continue to be the number one vector. And since then, I've moved on to web and gateway, and now I'm into the network analysis side of things, doing more on the proactive side. I want to, let's see, am I advancing? There we go. So I want to talk about demonstrating the value of this CTI information. And this was not a setup. I'm actually going to skip through this slide here. 21% said they can't measure it. This looks like Megan set me up, because this is her last slide and this is my first slide. What they're finding most useful, those that took the survey, is of course that top section. This is stuff where they're looking for indicators. They're looking for specific behaviors and tactics and techniques, all those things that can help you detect either to prevent the intrusion of an attack, but also today we're of course trying to detect something that's already on our network. And so a lot of this information is what most of the survey respondents found useful. They need to detect. Can't do anything else if you can't detect it. And then of course, I don't have to go into this much detail because Megan kind of covered this. There is some value in that broader attack information about vulnerabilities. That gives you some proactive capabilities. We just went through a big fire drill here with the log4j shell, all of those vulnerabilities that we need to be patching. There's so many all the time these days that you kind of have to prioritize them. And that's where having that information about which vulnerabilities are actually being used by attackers helps you get that priority. And then of course, if it's even something you use that needs to be addressed. And then of course, there's some of this information that tends to fall in the nice to know category. This is more on the education. It's not truly just nice to know. It's a little more important than that, but it is something that isn't going to help you deal with your immediate need. And so this is where we saw the breakdown of what is useful. So if you're going to measure the value, which is what I really want to talk about, how do you measure the value of your CTI programs? It really seems to be on your ability to detect. So I want to go on and, for just defense, to block things coming in, first of all, you've got to collect the right feeds. Here I've just shown you a snippet of a couple of different university studies. The one on the left here was a study done by universities across Europe. The one on the right, universities across North America. Each of them done and presented their results. The bottom line is what they found was that from all the different feed sources that you can get, no matter where you're going, it's no matter what feed you got, it's going to be almost mostly unique. It's stuff that you're not going to find elsewhere. There was only an 11% overlap between all the different feeds in these two different studies that they tested and compared. One of those, two of those sources had an 11% overlap. That means that 90% of the data was unique in each of the two data sets they were comparing. You've got to get a blend. And so now we go to the bullets on the less sexy bullet text on the left, where you need to get a variety of feeds, whether they're industry or regional feeds. Some of them can be very specific to your region. Your country may have lists. You want to leverage all the sources you can, including open source and proprietary and your own collections. You're going to have your own custom lists. And then, of course, you need to choose your list based on your false positive sensitivity. Some feeds are not meant for detecting and blocking. That's not their purpose. They give you everything they've seen that's been kind of sort of related to a certain kind of attack. A lot of the phishing lists are like that, where they'll say, here's all the URLs that we've seen in phishing emails. Well, sometimes the phishing emails include legitimate stuff amongst the malicious stuff. And so these feeds end up with some stuff that it's a false positive. You shouldn't really be blocking it. So you need to collect the feeds. You need to clean the feeds. There was also shared earlier in this survey. Respondents use a lot of tools. Mainly, their number one use for tools is to deduplicate the data between them. Okay, that's a good first step. But there's really a lot more that you can do beyond that. Now, what I want to talk about is the automating the distribution, getting the IOCs out fast. Now, when we talk about IOCs, it's called indicators of compromise for a reason. It includes things that they're useless until after it gets on your network. So it might be something that an IPS might use. It might be something that you might catch outbound traffic that says, oh yeah, well, we must have something on our network or it wouldn't be calling out to that site, like a command and control server. So what I want to propose is, and Eclectic IQ does tip, we have a rudimentary tip. It's not a full-fledged thing like Eclectic does. Whether it's in-house tools or professional tools, you need something that can take all of these different feeds. And I've added a little diagram here where, you pick your CTI vendors of choice, you use open source feeds, government feeds, industry feeds, maybe feeds from your your tools. I mean, if you've got an EDR solution, it's got a feed, you might be able to extract that feed and put that into the mix. Firewall, SWG, gateway tools. So all the different tools that you get, or from a vendor like Infoblox, when you buy our one product, we give you up to 26 different feeds to choose from. A lot of vendors are doing that now. A lot of different products, they don't just come with their feed. They'll give you multiple feeds because they're starting to realize no one vendor can solve it all. You need the threat intel. In fact, the threat intel is the big differentiator here, right? You can buy, or not buy, you can get an open source tool, a free open source tool to do a firewall, to be your secure web gateway, to be your emails. All of these security tools, there are open source versions of them. They just don't have the backing of the threat research teams that vendors are investing in heavily. And so you want to make sure that you've got that threat intelligence, because the tool by itself is useless without the threat intelligence. And after that, the differentiators become bells and whistles. Oh, this has a canned report. Oh, this one I'd have to build it ad hoc. But the beauty of the feed, getting back to the point of where's the value? How do I get value out of this threat intelligence? The first value is, of course, that if you see there's thin lines of feed data coming from CTI vendor A, just a very skinny line, that goes into a tip, which in our case, we call it Tide. I used our own diagram for, self-serving purposes. But out of your tip will come a super feed that has all the elements from all those different feeds, and that then get distributed to all of your tools. If you were just using the feeds from, let's say, your web application firewall, if just that feed was all that was going into it before, now the web application firewall has all the stuff that the vendor provided, plus some additional stuff. Namely, every tool in your suite gets uplifted and becomes more effective. And so your first value is detection, and that's what everybody said they see value in. But here's the next step, is if you've got this data normalized, not just deduplicated, but normalized so that the names of threats and other information is correlated, when it ends up in your SIM or whatever your hunting or investigation tool is, the alert that came from the web application firewall, the alert that came from the next gen firewall, the alert that came from your endpoint solution, all of them can be more easily correlated. So you start getting more value out of your SIM or your threat hunting tool or whatever you're using on the back end for investigation and response. Those tools become more effective because the event information has been not just deduplicated, but normalized in a way that it's easier to connect the dots. So your investigation and response actually ends up being a benefit and receiving just a much more streamlined process. Now, I'm going to actually pull here from another survey that was done by SANS. This was called the Security Operations Center, done just last year. And taking that data and being able to apply it to your security frameworks, like in this case, NIST and MITRE were what respondents to this survey said they found most useful. They were either using NIST or MITRE, and in some cases, they were using an additional model for certain work cases. This is not uncommon because if you're not familiar with a lot of frameworks, some frameworks are really good at just organizational and procedural to help you with your workflow of working through a problem, working through an attack situation, whereas others are very canned about what to do at every stage and step. So people will use a variety of models, but the NIST and MITRE frameworks are the most important. If your data that's coming out of all of your systems with your CTI is not presentable or accessible in a way that can be aligned with the framework, you've now created another burden. So you also want to make sure that whatever tools you're using can also normalize that data and then make it accessible and easily adaptable to be presented within a framework, so that again, your responders will be able to know all the information they need at every stage of their response activity. And we are clicking and things are not moving. There we go. Oh, here's the great picture here. Doing a study of our own, people who do that, who can take this and get all the data collected together, all the event data and the CTI data all together in once. And this includes, I bulleted it out, device data. it used to be, oh, if I'm going to investigate, I need to take my event, which is an IP address, and I need to associate it with the user. And with knowing something about the user and what kind of work they're doing, oh, that's a normal thing for them. That's not an issue. A different kind of user, hey, they should never even be going to places like that. That's suspicious. I'm going to block them right away. Identifying the severity of the situation and even making a decision about how to respond, you always want to know about the user. Today's networks have more devices than they have users. With IoT, with operational technologies, if you're in manufacturing, retail, things like that, gas and oil, there's so many different industries now that operational technologies are everywhere. And you need to know if one of those things have been compromised. True story, yesterday, my Ring doorbell started calling out to a command and control center. It had been hacked. Devices like that have been hacked before, home routers and things like that, that somebody's trying to collect a bunch of them so they can use them typically for something like a denial of service attack or something. But somebody had actually tried to breach my Ring doorbell through an automated update system. IoT, OT, it's all here to stay. And let's not forget BYOD and tablets. I mean, your average user has multiple devices. So knowing who the user today, that's not enough. You need to know about the device. Oops, went one too far here. Last time I clicked 3 times to get 1 slide. Now I click 1 slide, I go 2 slides. Then you want to make sure that all this data, this rainbow is that arch of the things that you can connect with. This is, they call it an ecosystem, but if you can have an event come in and it automatically triggers, somebody actually asked the question about, how different things are used, like ServiceNow for a ticketing system. Well, yeah, I can have an event come in based on the data. I can say, you know what, this just needs to go to the help desk. It's on this kind of device. They manage those systems. I'm just going to alert them. But what if I could also trigger a vulnerability scan so that when that ticket gets serviced, when they open it up and say, oh, I need to look into this, they can also look at a vulnerability scan that was run just moments before. They have the latest information at their fingertips to make a decision and realize, crap, we rolled out a patch last week. It looks like this one device didn't get it for some reason. Those things happen. So you want all that information. Again, this is why you start out with good CTI, good systems to process it. On the back end, your investigation, your response all goes much smoother. And I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to run through a quick example here. Oh, and it looks like my build stayed. So I'm going to quickly go through the builds. Here we go. Essentially, today you have to go and get data from lots of different places. This is a major time waster. That customer earlier that referenced that they save 2/3 of their investigation time, namely they doubled the number of investigations they could do every day simply by automating all of this data collection. So they don't have to go to every single source. They still have to go to some that, they might have to go out to a whois if they're going to do a little research on the source of the attack, things like that. But there are systems that even automate that. I mentioned that and then all of a sudden I realized, well, crap, my own solution does that. We'll pull it in automatically, but you're still going to have to chase some of it. But what if 90% of what you need is at your fingertips the moment you go in? Again, having that all automated with all that CTI, that's the stuff that will really simplify things down. So again, I'm going to zip through the build because we are a little over time. So now if I can automate that stuff, the key thing that I want to point out is an IPAM system. We don't tend to think of IP address management as something that's a security tool. But if I can get all my CTI aggregated and correlated through a good tip and just managed automatically through there and providing me the interface that I can then access that intelligence to do my research and investigation and having it normalized, do that on that side. But CTI by itself doesn't do anything. You now need to know about the user, about the device, about the environment that it was being run on. If the user's remote, maybe they were on-prem and remote when different things happen. Can you correlate all that? Is it all in the same place? Something like an IPAM database can track a lot of that information if you start looking at those tools. What's more is once you've identified, yes, this device is infected, it is compromised, and it's because they were visiting these sites. What if you could then go back and, got one more big build, here we go. Then I can identify every other device in the IPAM database that has also gone to that place. It didn't trigger an alert at that point because remember, today's attacks don't come in and wham, bam, they're gone. They just build up over time? Well, you can get those early indicators. All of these are tools that you can use through something like a tip, something like using your IPAM database. All this is stuff that's going to help you measure your value and see results from your CTI program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Definitely another interesting presentation. I also like the kind of unwanted synergy between like the previous presentation. Like you started where Megan left off. That was nice. It wasn't planned, so this is
We
nice.
didn't plan it. No.
And also was that's great. And also was interesting. Like you basically gave us yet another perspective on the same question, where we had already Megan perspective and we had our responders perspective, all different, all valid, which is great. Thank you again. I'll see you later. And our next speaker now is David Monnier, who is a fellow at Team Camry and also the head of infrastructure and service over Team Camry. I'll let David tell us a bit more about himself and then take it from there. The mic is yours.
Thank you, Pasquale. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever it is, wherever you are. Thanks very much for joining us today. And thank you to the SANS folks for inviting us to participate. We hope today to discuss some about the survey findings, as well as some of the results from some surveys that we have conducted ourselves with some of our partners who are making use of the next, what we like to believe is the next evolution of threat intelligence, kind of how to apply it dynamically and actively. I'm Dave Monnier, Team Camry Fellow. I've been with Team Camry for about 15 years. At Team Camry, we started off the company to try to understand how miscreants were going to misuse the internet. We were early people in kind of understanding the botnet problem, things like that. And we understood that the network that connects everyone was going to be largely the piece where intelligence was going to be most applicable or most beneficial. So we really set out there to get our start. Now we are a feed provider. We provide lots and lots of dynamic and static information. And today I'm going to be talking some about threat intelligence feeds, some of their limitations and kind of how to overcome those using a more dynamic and diverse set of data. I'll go ahead and give my shot at operating the slides here. Let's see how this goes. Seems to be working, which is good. Okay, so what I'd like to talk to you about today is kind of some about the next evolution of the application of cyber threat intelligence. I think a lot of us have solid understandings of kind of how the marketplace works today. Vendors, we provide to kind of the marketplace selections of indicators, IOCs, that we typically collect based on various methods. People may run global collection apparatuses in the forms of honeypots, sync polls, things like that, hoping to collect and elicit traffic. Some collect malware, do detonations of malware, identify what are the C2 components, what are the IPs involved, so that you could create some type of policy in your controls around kind of what was found in that research. But what we'd like to show is how kind of a next step going beyond that, and that is trying to provide kind of context around events that people see. So what we wanted to do to understand that was to see how teams were making use of data today, and in particular, how they were extending those capabilities that you would see in a traditional feed. So we went out, met with a large collection of our partners. Again, like I said, we provide threat intelligence in the form of feeds through various vendors directly to large enterprises, but we also have a capability that involves more like an ad hoc or a request mechanism, where you could take something of interest and ask our platform what you've seen of it. So those are the folks that we largely talk to, because we think that as far as how to implement feeds and the outcomes of using feeds and things like that, we think a lot of people have that understanding. So what we wanted to do was talk mostly to our folks that had modernized or upscaled their program. And what they described was a situation where they felt there were three still major issues that they faced regularly, one being email protection gaps. The biggest problem that some of those folks faced, in particular in like pharmaceutical sciences and economic research and analysis, was that they were exchanging document types that also have a history of being exploitation transportation mechanisms. So, for example, spreadsheets that have macros built into them. Well, it turns out that it's critical for research analysts to be able to have those macros function. It's how they work with the data that's found in their attachments. So modern email systems often, the protection systems often have a gap there where they have a hard time detecting something that's malicious or something that's legitimate. Alert triage was also a huge topic for our folks. Majority of them commented that when they take the application of indicators of compromise and they apply it to a large volume of service, that's where, for example, web accesses or service accesses, what they were finding was that just so many things touch their enterprise at a given day that without any type of context, they end up with this very large volume of alerts. But obviously not all of those alerts, some are scanners and maybe some are targeted attacks, but telling the difference between the two of them was very, very difficult for them. So that kind of lack of context that they were fighting with. And then lastly was ransomware, which everybody understands to be the problem. Modern ransomware doesn't work like the very original ransomware. The original ransomware could kind of operate in a vacuum where the infection could happen. It would do the encryption, and then you would be challenged to send your monies to typically some type of cryptocurrency wallet. Modern ransomware, though, the ransomware gangs have realized that it's much better if you've got access to somebody's network. They figured out it's better to exfiltrate the data first and then encrypt it so that you can start to work and identify other opportunities to get additional exploitation, typically funds, blackmail, insider trading, those types of things based on the data that you've been able to take from the target. That takes ransomware and puts it more, a little bit more into kind of the traditional threat space, because there becomes these network signal components that you can look for because it isn't just an immediate encryption and hope you pay. So because they've kind of evolved into this additional model, it gives people the opportunity to do better detections for it. And those were the three issues that our folks had said were the biggest issues for them. And so what we wanted to take a look at was how they were able to better solve them by kind of taking things to the next level with the application of threat reconnaissance. So this is going to be a brief show of what exactly that means and how that works. So I think the best way to describe this is thinking of threat intelligence on a continuum related to maturity. So think of threat intelligence meaning here's your standard CTI, here's your feeds, coming from a vendor describing these are the various threat types. These are various IP addresses within those threat types. You could block them. These are various domains within that. You should block them. These are various malware hashes. You should block them. Inherently, this process has some processing required. So there must be a detection. That detection then has to be verified, then curated, put into some type of transport, and then sent out into the world where various control devices can turn it into policy. So for example, this is a real example of some domains, by the way. These are related to APT 34, sometimes called Helix Kitten or Oil Rig. It's a nation state actor group believed to operate on behalf of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is a set of data that we were able to take some published information related to an APT campaign that had two sets of domains that were in use, adobelicense.com and msnconnection.com. They had two FQDNs for both of them, DNS and Resolve for those. And what they did is those A records pointed to had specific IP addresses that were in use for those. And if you think, again, like in kind of traditional CTI sense, this detail, this information is actionable. You could take this information, put it in your routers, put it in your name servers, in the form of an RPZ or something like that. But this is actionable policy. But what happens is on the time, adversaries figure out that there are things that are being blocked. So they are able to change them up. That's the whole purpose, for example, of using DNS, is so that you can have the name point to new IPs as needed. So that's where kind of, when you think of like threat hunting, there are people, there are teams out there who can sit and kind of track an adversary as they make these changes. And so in that example, for an IP address, maybe the adversary adds another IP address to the A record for one of the domains. And a threat hunter could take that detail, and now that they have this new IP, and use even their own data or some public data in the form of like passive DNS, things like that. But you can look up and see what other details are related to that. So in this example, when the adversary added another IP address, we were able to see that there were some additional domains that were also pointed there. So, but what we feel is the next step, or the next evolution of this kind of hunting, is to be able to take broader data sets, and not just detection type data, but kind of overall data. And that's what we've put into our signal, pure signal platform Recon, is a broad set of data, more than 40 different types of data, from DNS data to flow data to malware sandbox data to certificate data to service banner data, all of this, and putting that together to provide a very specific, or to provide answers if you have a specific question about a specific IP, to give you the context around it of who's talking to what and so on. And that's what we were able to do precisely with this. So once we had these IPs, we were able to identify that these IPs were being managed. So these command and control IPs, using globally collected signal, we were able to see not just the victimology of who was talking to these C2s, but we were able to see who was managing these C2s, both via using Secure Shell, which is a remote terminal program you typically used to access Unix-like systems. Also using FTP, where they were staging malware for use in attacks later. And using that, once we identified who was managing these hosts, we were then able to take those IPs, pivot off of them, and see what else do they manage. So what you're seeing here is based on a starting point of these 4 IPs in these 2 domains that were kind of highlighting one campaign, that were part of one campaign. We were able to take that and illuminate and identify the entire technological footprint of a nation state actor, and proactively turn this information into policy so that we could proactively defend against these other threats before we even have received any type of malware or anything about those. We don't even necessarily know who the intended victims are for those campaigns, but we know that we're proactively blocked by them. And these were all previously unknown. As you know, in targeted attacks, it's sometimes very hard to get feeds that cover these, because they're often made specifically for you. So that's taking this model turns some of what are the traditional challenges, which is in prevention, it's very tricky to stop legitimate things and illegitimate things, because the rules simply can't accommodate always for things that are legitimate but look illegitimate. Your detection teams, often cyber threat intelligence comes in and it's dated. There's time that passes between detection, processing, and deployment. At the response layer, incident response teams often have only the visibility of the network, so they don't necessarily know, or within the context of this attack, were we targeted? Is this a drive-by? Or is this someone specifically looking for us? Or is this somebody just spraying the internet looking for victims? And then when it comes to recovery, without that visibility, without understanding exactly what adversaries' tools and tactics and methods of attacks are, without knowing that, oftentimes they won't know if an attacker has moved laterally within the network. So it makes recovery very tricky. And then if with visibility being only ending at your end border, monitoring threats becomes almost impossible. The only time you know what an attacker is doing is when they're touching your infrastructure. So with external visibility, global flow, it would allow you to see much greater distance and actually be able to monitor and conduct analysis on the adversaries that are targeting you. So taking that type of visibility turns into these types of solutions where you could proactively block things. So if you get one message that comes through, maybe an email message comes through and has links in there, you can take those links, dig into them, create specific policy, understand who's managing those links, understand what other infrastructure that those adversaries may have stood up, and truly start to monitor and understand what adversaries are doing before they do it to you. Somewhat think of it as sitting in a wildlife preserve in a blind, watching animals live in their natural habitat in the ways that you could learn about adversaries is quite similar to that. So the end result is great savings. So this was a Fortune 50 case study that we had done with Forrester. And what we found was on average, over 3 years, the same partners who had employed this new forward-facing method saved about $9 million. They had a great deal of reduction in risk to their business as far as breaches go, because they were able to dynamically defend against those things. They also were able to greatly reduce the number of subscriptions that they had, because instead of filling their controls with policy that may, it does, like a standard threat feed does tell you, hey, these are known bad things, but context says, but these 3 of them are the people who are targeting us. And that's how miscreants are often working now. They are targeting specific countries, specific verticals, specific regions, so that they can try to get that information out. So avoiding attacks, being able to, as mergers and acquisitions, being able to proactively assess someone, all of those types of things allowed for great savings from our partners by kind of taking threat intelligence and implementing the practice as threat reconnaissance. So that's what we have. Thank you very much for your time today. Being conscious of the time, it looks like I went just a little bit over. My apologies, Pasquale. And that's, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, David. Definitely all 3 interesting presentations. And I want to echo Bob's message on Slack, which is like, this was not prepared, like you didn't, let's say, work together on the slide deck. Everyone had his own, but the flow was, we started with Megan from the analysis perspective, and then with Bob going into, how this applies to, you can enhance incident response and how threat intel goes into incident response, and then with David on threat hunting, how we can also leverage intelligence in this other way, which is great. Absolutely. I would like to invite all the other speakers on camera so we can start the panel. We have already some questions that are coming, and I also would like to invite all the attendees to keep sending us questions. Use the Q&A on the Slack, the Q&A on the section on Zoom, or go on Slack on the discussion channel. Please use whatever means it's better for you. Either the Q&A, it's easier to track, but whatever you prefer. And we have already some nice questions. I would like to start with Megan. So you briefly touched on this a bit, looking how threat intelligence is being utilized. So I would like to ask you, what are some of the things that you, in your perspective, that a CTI analyst can do to make their analysis more relevant for the leaders and in general for the stakeholders, of course?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is really all about, relevance and seeing the impact of your work, right? That's what we all want. And a big part of that is making sure that the people in your organization who make decisions understand what you're doing and what they can do with it. And so my number 1 recommendation for that in any organization is understand your leader or your decision maker and understand how to communicate with them. And then based off that, like, you don't need to necessarily adjust the substance of what you're saying, but adjust your delivery so that it lands well with your leadership. I think that can look a lot like, becoming a very, very clear writer. That can look like understanding your leader's personality. Do they simply want to know the situation and then they make a decision, or would they be receptive to getting recommendations from you about how to move forward? I think it's really important for us as CTI analysts to understand and to write and communicate in a way that really respects the fact that our audience may know less about the topic than we do, but they have to make decisions with very complex information, and tailor your words that way. And then I think finally, one thing we have to do, if we're being honest with ourselves, is take feedback about our work, ask for feedback about what we're doing, and is it hitting the mark in terms of CTI analysis. And if you don't get feedback on your work, or if the feedback is negative, that in itself is feedback and an opportunity to adjust and to try to next time produce a product that is more relevant.
Absolutely, totally agree. And again, I rarely think any feedback is negative, because you should always find a way. Okay, why my message didn't reach the right audience, or didn't reach the audience in the way I wanted to. So it's definitely a way to learn and to make it better next time. I would like to ask if anyone, Bob or David, do you have any, if you want to add anything to this, any advice for our analysts on how to make better and more relevant analysis?
Yeah, I think keeping an analyst morale high, I think, is a big piece of that. I think I've been doing cyber for 26 years now, something like that, in some way, shape, or form. And one of the biggest things that I have realized is that it's an endless font of trouble. And it's no one ever thanks you. It's kind of like being a sysadmin. No one ever thanks anyone for their mail working. They only complain when it doesn't work. And I think cyber is the same way. And analysts often feel the pressure to perform. And I think if I had advice for the industry, it's to keep in mind that their analysts are constantly overworked and have great expectations on them. So I guess for morale is a key.
Absolutely. Thank you. I have another question. Next one is for Bob. I would like to ask you, we saw some among the results, as always, one of the key question, and there is a lot about in the CTI teams talking about, is about tools, and specifically about threat intelligence platform. So I would like to ask you, what, from the results we saw that the adoption is still not that high, it's not there yet. We are still catching up. So what's in your mind? Why do you think, what is holding back CTI teams for adopting threat intelligence platforms?
Well, there's a number of reasons, and actually Rebecca mentioned it when she led that there's a lot of companies that they just don't have the teams for it. And this doesn't have anything to do with company size. I know companies with thousands of employees, but they've just chosen to outsource everything. And the outsourcer doesn't seem to have a big motivation to automate stuff, since they charge by the hour. So they do their own custom things and manual things. And that's not to say those are all bad. There are some situations, I know most government agencies it doesn't apply to, but I know a few that they do things and they're required, because of all the conflicting regulations they have to acquire, that they have to do everything custom. But for the vast majority, TIPS can automate so much that I think a lot of people are not realizing how much they can gain. They think of the TIPS of when they first came out 5-6 years ago, where all they did was aggregate and deduplicate. That's all they did. But now they do a lot of very advanced things. And Megan probably will have a lot more to say on this, since their solution even goes far beyond what we do. We do some basics because of what our customers have asked for. We're kind of like the 80-20 rule, where we figure that 80% of them need this much, And then what Eclectic does is they give that other 20% for the people who want to do it all, do it right, 100%, you know. And there's advantages to both. But I think two reasons why they haven't acquired. Number one, a lot of them don't have the staff to do it inside, and their outside resources aren't going to present this as an option. And the second one is, if they are trying to do it, they're thinking of the way it was 4 or 5 years. This has been a very fast evolving market. Tips this year are doing things that last year you wouldn't have imagined. They continue to evolve quite a bit. And I don't think they realize what they could get from it. And it's worth taking a look.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I totally agree that it's a very fast moving. I mean, having been in the space for a while, I've seen the changes and features that like, you know, we were like, okay, hopeless a few years ago. They're actually now being implemented and things are moving pretty fast. Anyone else, David or Megan, want to add anything?
Come on, I set you up. You set me up so well in the presentation, Megan. I figured I owed you the favor.
No, thanks, Bob. I appreciate it.
Okay. So next question I would like to ask David. So one of the key takeaways also was mentioned by Rebecca, and it was a point through the survey, was the way to measure effectiveness. We were like of several things, like effectiveness of you know, the threat intel program itself, but also how can you measure the tools to be effective? You know, because you need to justify. We talked about the staffing. We talked about you need to justify the investment on the team and on the tools. And if you can't measure it, that's getting hard. So how are you like any like advice, or how are you, for example, helping teams to measure the effectiveness of a threat hunting or threat reconnaissance tool?
Yeah, a lot of that comes back to the automation. So when you're applying threat intelligence, you know, the purpose of static intelligence is to alleviate your human analysts from having to do, you know, every detail of every step. And you're preserving that time. You're preserving those human analysts for when you need a better contextual understanding of something. So when I sit down to look at an intelligence offering, how I measure, historically, how I've measured it is how much of my team's bandwidth have I just freed up? Meaning like how much of this is actionable and accurate. So this includes how few false positives there are and how many accurate positives there are within the data. And then how much additional bandwidth does my team now have that they didn't have before to look at either context around the detections that we do have, meaning again, trying to understand, is this someone who has targeted us, or is this someone who just happened to come by and test our doorknob? And then more importantly, and this is what I really think is key, is how much of my team's bandwidth do I have left to be able to look at the threats that no vendor could have warned me about, because the adversary is targeting only me. And nobody's tools out there could have let me know that this domain was bad because it was registered to be used only against me. So some amount of analyst capability is still kind of critical to be there, to be ready for that inevitable attack that does get through your controls, does get into and become a problem, so that you have humans that are ready to not have to be stopped to choose what fire to put out, but actually are able to focus on this new fire and get that context, get that understanding, be able to pull out what IOCs there are from this successful attack, so that you can look and see what else might be done to you. And unfortunately, no vendor can kind of warn you for those moments. You have to have people, ready to do that.
Yeah, and I would double down on that as well. I think that's right on. People are measuring either, hey, did we actually have time to do outside projects compared to, in past years, we could only spend, a couple hundred hours on some outside projects. But last year we spent 800 hours doing additional projects that were not, responding to incidents. So some people measure the stuff they do beyond security. One of the problems I see, one of the bad ways I've seen do it is just saying, well, this is how many incidents per person we're able to do, on average. That doesn't take into account how many you're quickly able to triage because you've improved your triage process. And you're actually now spending more time on the big problems because you have more time to spend. So, I think it's important that if you got to do some sort of a roll-up report to the high levels, that you take your, your investigation and your response, break them into separate categories, maybe 3 or 4 subcategories based on your industry and how you're set up, that, those lines will be different. That's why I'm not going to recommend anything specific, but it could be that, in prior years, only 87% of our stuff were we able to resolve within an hour or less. But last year we were able to resolve 92, 93, and you find that sweet spot. And as long as you're able to maintain that, that's the other thing. It doesn't have to improve every year. At a certain point, you get about as good as you can get. And you just need to prove that you're continuing, that your investments are maintaining your high level of ability there. So, you can either measure how much time you're able to do or time spent doing non-core response and IR stuff, or you can break down the IR into some subcategories and measure your effectiveness in that. But you definitely want to get rid of those outliers. I mean, if you had to spend, just how much time did you spend on log4j? That will throw off all the statistics of the things you were able to do quickly. So you want to get those outliers out. It's kind of like the Olympics, you take the high judge and throw them out and the low judge, throw them out and average the ones that are meaningful. And that's how I think you can show your effectiveness.
That's indeed a good way to measure, and for sure, I totally agree with the time. It's a finite resource we have, and that's the one how we can then, of course, around which we should try to shape the work of the teams. Megan, is there anything you want to add?
Well, I would just say this is incredibly challenging to do, right? Measure your effectiveness, especially when you work in a field
Absolutely.
where one of the elements of your job is warning. The paradox of warning is real. So you make some recommendations and people beef up security, and then the event that you said might happen doesn't happen. And, you run the risk of people asking, well, what, so what? It didn't happen. See, there was no big deal. I think, it helps in these situations to take a very wide view of your program and your team's learning, and if you can demonstrate things like, not only did we not have a security incident that caused us to just stop work, but we did get a new tool and our team fully understands how to use it. We learned that this year. If you can demonstrate change over time, I think that really helps. And I think one really big indicator of effectiveness, especially in CTI, is if people who don't do CTI see the value of it. I think that means that you are being effective, at least in communicating why CTI is important.
That's absolutely a great takeaway. I like it. Thanks. So next question, I'll leave it open to the 3 panelists, whoever wants to take it. It's somehow linked also linked to the previous one. It's from the audience, if we have seen any IT ticketing systems like ServiceNow best be used by CTI teams. So how to track basically. Do you have any, let's say, personal experience? I guess I see everyone nodding. So it's a good point, definitely touched by our audience.
Yeah, that's been a question in the Q&A panel here for a while. And I look at it and I go, well, there's like a dozen different ways to answer that. Because CTI is not just one thing. CTI is so many different things. There's so many different sub roles within it. So for example, there may be some things that you're going to run across in CTI that you need to share with certain groups that you don't normally need to share it with. You might have something like Slack. You might have something you want to share with the help desk, like anything that has anything to do with vulnerabilities. We're seeing new attack activity that leverages certain vulnerabilities. You might want to put in a service ticket, say, hey, double check and make sure we've got these things patched because there's some new threats. And then it's up to that team to decide, ignore it. Are we going to do a vulnerability scan? What are we going to do next? That, so you can use that to share information. Sometimes ServiceNow is just a convenient communication tool. And I see some people where they automate it so much. And it's like, yeah, why don't you just I'm the only person who reads it. Why don't you just send me a Slack message? That's all it took. You could have pinged me right then, but now I got to log into ServiceNow to read the message that you could have just shot to me. So you want to balance out what's the right way to use it. And then again, we use it to automate all the simple things. So it's incident response for us. There's so many things that if you have enough data, as David was talking about, automate a lot of this. Including the data collection. If you can get all that data together, your tools might be able to make a decision that this is something that, yeah, a human's going to have to look at it, but this fits a profile of something that we see all the time. Create a service ticket and send it to that new intern that we trained to handle this stuff. Let the expensive employees stay focused on the other stuff. So you can use ServiceNow also as a way to siphon off some of it's not noise, it's stuff that needs to be attended to, but it's stuff that we have a playbook and anybody with basic knowledge and training can deal with it. So you can use ServiceNow for that. There's other ways. I'll let others speak, but those are the two that came to mind to me. Is number one, it gets overused when you probably should just IM somebody, or email might be better. And then it's also a way to automate a lot of the low-hanging fruit that could be easily dispersed to other people and get it off the plate of the high-end analysts.
Absolutely. Anyone else wants to add anything?
I'll just jump in and say,
Go ahead.
Thanks.
No,
I'll just jump in
Megan.
and say, when I heard the question, I kind of chuckled a little bit, and I thought, here's where all those email response or email and spreadsheet responses came in for how we manage things. And my gut reaction to go along with what Bob said is just that so much depends on your organization, how big you are, whether or not you're geographically dispersed and it's easy to reach out and speak to somebody. If you know what, if a spreadsheet works for you, use it all day long. But just find what's effective for your organization. I haven't seen a particular ticketing system that stands out above others, but whatever's effective, that's what I go for.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with Megan and Bob both. It's not just about what you're using. It's critical to think about why you're using and how you're using. Like the number one misunderstanding when it comes to intelligence is the application of intelligence gives you events, not incidents. So not every event warrants some type of massive response like that. And that sometimes gets lost. And that type of rigid staying to the policy of everything that we see, every match of an IP that we see in our logs has to go now, and a person has to come and click and approve this, and all of this stuff ends up in just complete burnout for people. So that type of effectiveness, it's critical that people say, well, it's not our process, it's the outcome of the process that we need to be in pursuit of. So I don't think it matters what tool. I think it's that type of tool agnostic and kind of that event-driven reality is why we saw people saying that ad hoc was how often they mostly updated their stuff, and that whatever tools they had, email, spreadsheets, whatever, and that because they go hand in hand and they're focused on what works.
Oh, I do want to chime in.
Absolutely.
And David, you said something that triggered something. We all work with Gartner and Forrester and those analysts. And as I've been talking to about the automation thing, which David, in your presentation, you doubled down on the value of automation. One of the things they said is that there's a lot of companies claiming automation, and all they really mean is they can send and create a trouble ticket. That's all they do. So on the automation thing, let me just call out that that's not really what automation promises. That's okay. It's worthwhile. It's useful. But if you're looking for products that do automation, drill in and look at the things like, that Cumry, Infoblocks, and ThreatIQ, there's so much more beyond that we can automate.
Yeah, I thank you, because I think those are all great insights. And also you highlighted the fact that, most of the time I see the frustration when we give the answer, it depends, right? Because indeed it depends, right? As also Megan highlighted, like teams are organized way differently for each organization, even within the same sector. So it's not all, there is no one, let's say one tool, one answer that fits them all. So absolutely. So I like the conclusion, like what works best for you, for sure. It's the right one. Okay, we have many other questions, which is great. Please keep them coming towards the channel. So next question I would like to ask is, we talked about like also based on your experience, Megan, like some of the best practice that CTI analysts could could pull from other intelligence disciplines. So you talked about your experience moving into the more cyber related part of the house, but if you have any best practice you want to share.
Well, I was really pleased to hear that. I think some of the best parts of more. Oh, did you hear my dog? She's sorry if you heard my dog. She was growling at the.
I thought it was my snowplow. Don't worry about it.
Nope.
No problem.
There's a delivery truck outside. Clearly, I was really pleased to see that so a lot of the best practices from traditional intelligence analysis are already being done in CTI. And like I mentioned earlier, I was super impressed to see the percentages of respondents in the survey who said, yep, I use structured analytic techniques and I use models to think through things. I think that is excellent. I think one thing we're really pressured to do in traditional intelligence analysis, non-cyber, is try to make a prediction about the trajectory that a trend will go in. And I think that would be helpful for leaders who are making decisions about CTI resourcing, especially. And one thing that I think is difficult in CTI, and I value others' opinions on this, is I think it's so difficult because of the amount of data that we deal with. It's really challenging for analysts to visualize what is actually happening or to convey it to a non-CTI audience in a way that makes sense. So, one thing that I'm kind of hunting for is a great way to help express CTI data visually in a way that's not overwhelming, because we can certainly put things on a graph and see clusters of activity. But I think there are people out there who just look at that and just see the clusters, right? So yeah, lots of good best practices that I think can go both ways, especially as CTI matures.
Absolutely. Anyone else wants to add?
I would chime in that I have a daughter-in-law who works in the financial institution and has for years as an analyst. And when I started getting into threat hunting, and she was probably in her second year of doing that job, and I was talking to her about it, she was showing the way that they do their analysis, because it's corporate lending, that kind of stuff. And they'll look at a corporate entity and the history of behavior of that entity that they might, they're trying to decide, am I going to give them a lot of money? And as she was building that out, then I went and talked to our analysts in the threat labs, and they're talking about how they look at threat actors and their history of behavior and what they're most likely to do next. And the methods are very, very similar. And it sounded, that's the stuff that clicked in my mind as Megan was explaining, that, the ability to analyze a person's behavior and predict the future comes across so many different disciplines. They use it in medicine when they talk about, coronavirus is going to become Delta, become Omicron. They've seen that kind of a thing before. They don't always know, but after they've seen a few transitions, now they do have a good idea. And now all the recommendations they're not scared so much because it's not unknown. They now feel they understand it better. They're making better decisions. We can do that and apply that same methodology in threat research. That was the stuff that in that chart that both Megan and I shared on what they find most useful. The threat actor information was the stuff they don't currently find most useful, because we as an industry, the security industry, we don't do a lot of analysis there. There's very few. And now I'm going to watch, Megan. I'm going to see what you guys do, because you were the one who raised this. I'm expecting you to do that, because that's something we really don't get. Everybody's so focused on indicators of compromise. And that's just telling me how to find something now. It doesn't tell me how to prepare. The only thing I've got for future preparedness is vulnerability patching. That's really all I got. And other than that, it's kind of gut instinct by, that threat actor, they used to do healthcare for 5 years, and all of a sudden they're starting to do financial. I'm going to guess they're going to do the same stuff they have been doing, But if I really looked into it, I might find stuff they have been doing doesn't even work anymore. Even in healthcare, those things have been plugged. Those techniques don't work anymore, which means I really still have no idea what they're going to do now in the financial sector. I think we're really bad at that. And we need to maybe get more people from those other industries into the security industry and have them apply those capabilities here.
Yeah, I would
Absolutely.
absolutely agree with that. I think a lot of the
Yeah, please go
security industry today is driven by what I would describe as SIGINT, which is great because it's all data, it's all facts. It alleviates the typical potential for an analyst bias, which is never a good thing. So causality and things like that kind of goes away. But like Megan and Bob have pointed out, we lack the ability to kind of forecast then, right? I mean, we can say, well, this is likely where this DGA is going to create a domain next, but that's not really forecasting. That's our technical understanding of domain generation algorithms. You know what I'm saying? That's not forecasting. That's not forecasted intelligence. And I think typically, one of the big challenges we face as an industry on our side is that the types of personalities that are good at signal analysis typically, and no offense, this is myself included, but we lack of things like empathy and understanding of the things that like our human counterparts have a considerable advantage to us. And I think we could gain a great understanding of kind of the adversaries we face in cyber if we better understood kind of the economic conditions that are making adversaries do these things, kind of understand the political positions and kind of how all this intertwines. And I think our partners on the human side and financial intelligence side and business intelligence folks, I believe that there's a lot of future opportunity for cross-pollination there. And that we as people on the cyber side, like I said, I hate to say it, but we may be largely ill-equipped to be able to do it to begin with, because we're analytical thinkers in numbers and not in emotions.
Definitely, I thought I would quote everything because I really think, one great point I think you highlighted, which sometimes the more technical folks we tend to forget, is that the threat is not the malware, the threat is the human. So we just keep focusing on the malware while we keep forgetting that there is much more than that. And for sure, like you all highlighted, the kind of having a diversity of background and roles within the team. It's definitely I think I would say a must-have for each intelligence team. It's not just there is more than a domain. There is more than an IP. There is more than just the malware sample there. I think, no, okay, I saw someone raising, no, okay, good. And we go ahead with the next question. A question for you, David. You mentioned the flow for the nice flow, let's say unprepared flow of the presentation. In your eye, you should ask the value of threat intelligence, more focusing on hunting. What is your definition of the threat hunter? Like, how would you define the role?
Yeah, so elite threat hunter is someone who doesn't focus solely on the security component, right? To give you an idea, let's use the analogy of a house, defending a house, right? So an average security person is going to come and say, make sure your doors and windows are locked, right? A intermediate level person may come and say, and make sure that you have steel core doors. Make sure that you have an alarm system. Make sure that you have someone helping to monitor you. But an elite security person might say, watch for people being able to cut through the vinyl siding on the side of your home and slip through the center of your wall and not even use your door or not even come through the window. And that type of kind of diverse thinking is what I'm describing. So when I think of an elite hunter, it's someone who understands how TCP works inherently. It's someone who understands the difference between MD5 Ivan Shaw as a hashing technology. It's someone who, has a broad and diverse kind of understanding, and they're not just an incident handler, but they're a person who kind of understands the electronic ecosystem. And that's what I believe is the thing that turns a security practitioner into someone who becomes an elite practitioner, is kind of that broad and diverse foundational knowledge and how to apply it. And that also includes peer involvement and things like that. An elite hunter is someone who knows how to talk to other people and not, only be able to work by themselves, things like that. But it's those types of, on top of your security understanding, it's those other skills that really make someone elite. And I think it takes time, and I think it takes exposure to technologies to really bring those people up to speed, so that they know kind of what disparate data sets to bring to bear on a problem. Like if you wanted to know what somebody was doing at a certain time somewhere, you need to know where to go look. And if you're talking data types, you have to know, well, what type of data types would come from that type of behavior? What could we go look for? And that type of core knowledge is what I think makes people elite.
Absolutely, and that's why I agree. And having an understanding, like you say, of you not only need to know what you should look for, but where and how. Like an understanding of your tool set, like what tools you have at your disposal. So there is a much more than just understanding what should I look for, but also how and where, which is not always I would say immediate. I have a question coming from another question coming from our audience, and which is linked also to some of the takeaways and points you all of you highlighted. So the question is there is a lot of praise for analysts using intuition, but there is also a lot about analyst bias and the need to avoid it. Can anyone give a statement to bring congruency to these statements? And I would like to link this to one of the trends we showed in the results, which is indeed the most frequently used analytic method was intuition and experience-based judgment. If anyone, maybe we can do say a random table and to how can we make a bit more work with the tool, how can we, yes, praise and intuition is definitely something we should use, but also how can we help? What are other ways that analysts can use to leverage other models like diamond model, kill chain, and any other analytic techniques that can also avoid helping biases? I
want to hear from Megan first, since this was what her presentation was on.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and it's pretty nuanced. So yeah, I jotted down some notes. What immediately comes to mind with this question is first just recognizing the limitations of both data and our intuition, and recognizing that they really do complement each other. When you have data that's telling you one thing, but really you just feel in your gut that that's not the whole story, or if you can't gather the data that you really need to answer the question, that's where I see intuition and judgment and experience stepping in. And I think that the balance between relying on intuition and veering into bias it's a fine line. But what I've found is that if you can articulate the fact that, hey, I don't have the data to support this, but I really feel strongly about this, or what, the data say this, but I don't have great confidence in it, and I can't quite articulate why. I've found that being able to do that is very often, acceptable, and people will say, okay, I can understand where you're coming from here. The concern with biases is that they're so unconscious, we never really articulate them. So I find that if you're able to just say, here's the limit of the data, here's the limit of my intuition and what it's telling me, then you're probably doing all right. And then the final thing I would add is, there's an element of trust here when we talk about moving from data to intuition. And one of the best things that somebody ever told me early in my career was, at some point, you just have to trust yourself, and you just have to know that after you do this for even a short period, like 6 months, you are going to know more about this than so many other people, than most of the population. So, you know, your intuition is valid. Your bias isn't, right? But your intuition is. Over to David and Bob.
Yeah, so in that regard, I would say I totally agree, for starters. But I would say I think one of the realities that I don't think many of us in the industry realize is we operate with an inherent bias, and that is we believe the CTI, in particular when it comes to IOCs are a bias, believe it or not. Like if you're as a practitioner, if you're recording only matches, if your instrumentation records only what you told it to look for in advance, you're relying on your intuition of what you think is going to happen to you. So if something outside of that realm happens to you, you're not going to be able to see it. So we take a much more agnostic approach and say record absolutely everything, so that later when something happens, you can go back to it and say, we don't know what this is, but this is it. And that type of bias avoidance is something that I think we as an industry often completely overlook. And we think of intuition as the analyst, the human guessing what an adversary is going to do next, but we overlook that even the event that we started with had inherent bias because we were only looking for what we thought we should be looking for. Unknown protocols, for example, I mean, there are 255 possible IP protocols. Most practices look at 3. So that alone, I think, is suggestive of how inherent bias is into our practice.
Yeah, and I would say that, you know, this is also something where seasoning comes in. You know, analysts early on need to realize that, you know, they should trust their intuition, but they also should realize that they're still learning, and that's, you know, sometimes your first few incidents, if they all seem to be a certain type, then you tend to look at everything else and just assume it's probably going to be another one of those. As soon as you start with that, you're like a doctor who, when you walked in the door, they looked at it and says, oh boy, it looks like another one of those. I actually had that myself, where I had a doctor, I got treated. Now, I did have COVID later on, but I got treated for COVID. What I had was the flu. And until it turned into pneumonia and I ended up in a hospital, they didn't run the test to find out. They just made assumptions without digging into the data. So to David's point, you know, maybe, you know, you can't afford to collect everything. You know, if you do packet capture, good luck with your budget for storage. Even SIMs can get awfully expensive if you try to collect everything for too much history. But you do have to find the balance. You know, you're always going to find data you wish you had, but you don't want to just always look for, I mean, David gave the point of 3 protocols. You know, I think of the crime scene movies where the guy walks in and he says, well, what's going on here? And the officer there points and he says, well, you can see the desk is knocked over. So there was obviously a struggle, and there was this over here. And you know, and he's seen this whole malicious thing. And then the expert looks at it and he says, yeah, the desk is turned over. The person had a heart attack. They collapsed on the desk and it fell over. There's no murder here. This was an accident. There was a healthcare issue. 2 people seen the same evidence, but they jumped to different conclusions. That's what a seasoned analyst, you know, the true investigative expert versus the policeman on the scene. One's a newbie, one's seasoned and learns to take a step back and look at other options. I think an analyst who jumps to one answer is always going to be wrong. They need to look at it and try and boil it down to, if they're lucky, a handful of things that they can then go and look at secondary evidence and things like that. And that goes to that data. You know, you always need more data. As David was saying, I don't think you'll ever have enough.
Data is never enough. I totally agree. But yeah, that's are all great insight. I would say to close, like one quote from one of my mentors was, you know, like incident responders and security practitioners in general are paid for the bias because that's the experience. We as threat intelligence analysts are paid to avoid our biases. So it's like, it's this, like, we should, of course, we will have our biases, definitely. And there are some inherent, like David also showed, but having, you know, like an understanding of where the limitation are our thinking, and it's always super important. We are almost done. I would have like one last question, and I want to have 1 point from each of the speaker. Let's say if you are an individual who is starting CTI today, he or she was tasked with starting a CTI capability for their corporation. what like advice would you give? Like one thing to focus on. We can do it on the table. Megan first.
Oh, that's such a good question. I think this is one field where the amount of data out there is overwhelming and the urgency of it is pretty high. So I would say, approach it with some intellectual humility and realize that this is going to be a long haul, and celebrate your victories as you have them.
Bob?
I would say along that same line, if I was brought into an organization, I'm in charge of the CTI, first thing I would do is take a look at their visibility. The sources that they have for receiving CTI elsewhere, but also what can we see happening? Because I could be receiving wonderful threat intelligence, but I can't use it because I don't have the data on what's happening on my network to compare it to. So I really need to know what kind of visibility we have. And here's the important part: across my networking and my security pieces. Networking teams have a ton of data that and visibility tools, they are reluctant to share with security. It's getting easier, but find out what your visibility potential is first. Otherwise, you may not even have the right CTI mix today.
100% what Bob said. That's absolutely the case. If I was going to give a new program a single succinct piece of advice, it's record absolutely everything your budget and legal counsel will allow, and then worry about what to look for in it. So, because it doesn't matter how much threat information you have, all you'll have if you don't have a play to apply it is a reason to stay up all night, worried that all this stuff is going to happen to you.
Absolutely. I think all these are three great answers. And I hope, like, I'm sure we have many newcomers to the field that will definitely make good use of the advice. And I think we are done with time. I would have gone on for a while. I think we have many more questions that would be definitely interesting. But for everyone who attended, thank you very much. Thanks to all the panelists, and I will give now the floor to Carol for the closing remarks, and thank you again, everybody.
All right, well, thank you so much, Pasquale, Rebecca, Megan, Bob, and David, for your thoughts and great presentations, and to all of our sponsors who help bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.